I heard my daughter-in-law whisper, "Once she signs, everything will be ours." And in that moment, I realized the warmth I had trusted for years was nothing more than a carefully rehearsed performance. I didn't react. I didn't step into the hallway or let the floorboards creak beneath my feet. I simply stood there, just out of sight, my hand resting against the wall as if it could steady the quiet storm rising inside my chest. Their voices were low, almost gentle, the kind of tone people use when discussing something ordinary, something harmless. And that was what unsettled me the most. Not anger, not urgency, just calm certainty. I stepped back before they could notice me, returning to the living room where the soft glow of the lamp still cast a warm circle over the rug I had picked out 20 years ago. Everything looked the same. The same couch, the same framed photographs, the same faint scent of lavender from the candle I had lit earlier that evening. And yet, nothing felt the same anymore. Emily came in first, her smile already in place as if it had never left. "Mom, do you want some tea?" she asked, her voice light, caring, practiced. Daniel followed behind her, carrying a tray with 3 cups, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man who had nothing to hide. I looked at them, really looked this time, searching for something I had missed before. A flicker of guilt, a hesitation, but there was nothing, just the same kindness they had shown me for years. I smiled back, just as gently. "That sounds lovely," I said, my voice steady, almost unfamiliar to my own ears. Emily placed the cup in my hands, her fingers brushing mine briefly. "Chamomile," she said. "I know it helps you sleep." I nodded, taking a small sip, letting the warmth settle in my throat. Sleep. That word lingered in my mind longer than it should have, because something told me I wouldn't be sleeping much anymore. We sat together like we always did, the 3 of us in quiet comfort, talking about small things. The weather, the neighbor's new fence, a recipe Emily wanted to try next weekend. It was all so normal, so perfectly normal that it felt almost unreal. I watched them as they spoke, noticing details I had overlooked before. The quick glance they exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The way Daniel's hand rested just a little too close to Emily's when they discussed anything related to the house. The subtle shift in their tone whenever finances came up, even casually. "You've taken such good care of this place," Emily said at one point, her eyes drifting around the room. "It must be a lot to manage on your own." I let out a soft chuckle. After 35 years, it's second nature. She smiled, but there was something behind it now, something I could finally see because I knew where to look. "Still," she added, "it might be nice to simplify things. Less stress, you know." I nodded slowly, as if I were considering her suggestion, as if I hadn't just heard what they were really planning. The conversation moved on, but my mind stayed fixed on that single sentence I had overheard. "Once she signs." I turned my teacup slightly in my hands, watching the reflection of the lamp ripple across the surface. Signs what? And more importantly, when had they decided that everything I had would eventually belong to them? I didn't ask. I didn't confront them. Instead, I listened. I watched. I remembered. Because for the first time in a very long time, I understood that kindness can be the most convincing disguise, and I had been living with it under my own roof. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I had heard enough. Enough to stop trusting. Enough to start paying attention. And most importantly, enough to begin preparing for what would come next. That night, after they went upstairs, I remained in the living room long after the house had fallen quiet, the clock on the wall marking each second with a steady, indifferent rhythm. I did not turn on the television. I did not reach for a book. I simply sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, replaying every word I had heard, every glance I had dismissed over the past few months. It is a strange thing, realizing that the life you believed in was built on details you chose not to question. I had always thought of myself as careful, as someone who noticed things. But now, looking back, I saw how easily kindness had blinded me. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Just before sunrise, when the house was still wrapped in that soft, quiet stillness that comes before the day begins. I moved through my routine as I always did, making coffee, opening the kitchen window slightly to let in the cool air, placing a slice of toast on a plate even though I did not feel particularly hungry. When Emily came downstairs, she seemed surprised to see me already dressed, already sitting at the table. "You are up early," she said, her tone light, but her eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary. Could not sleep. I replied simply, taking a sip of my coffee. She nodded, then busied herself with preparing breakfast, moving around the kitchen with that same effortless familiarity she had developed over the years. It had once comforted me, seeing her treat this house as her own. Now, it felt different. Now, it felt calculated. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, greeting me with a polite smile before asking Emily about their plans for the day. They spoke as if I were not fully part of the conversation, their words flowing easily between them, punctuated by small pauses that seemed to carry more meaning than the sentences themselves. "We might stop by the bank later," Emily said casually, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Just to ask about a few things." Daniel nodded. "And maybe check on the paperwork we talked about last week." I kept my expression neutral, my gaze steady on the table in front of me. Paperwork. The words settled heavily in the air, though neither of them seemed to notice. Or perhaps they believed I would not notice. "That sounds productive," I said after a moment, my voice calm, almost approving. Emily smiled at me, that same warm, reassuring smile. "We're just trying to get everything organized. You know, for the future." "For the future." I nodded again, as if the phrase held no weight at all. But inside, something had shifted completely. I no longer heard their words the way I used to. I heard what was underneath them. After breakfast, I excused myself and went upstairs, closing the door to my bedroom softly behind me. The room looked exactly as it always had, filled with familiar things that had once brought me comfort. Photographs lined the dresser, each one capturing a moment I had believed was genuine. I walked over to the nightstand and opened the drawer, my fingers brushing against a small stack of documents I had not reviewed in quite some time. Insurance papers, property records, old correspondence. I had trusted that everything was in order because I had never had a reason to think otherwise. Now, I realized how dangerous that trust had been. I sat down on the edge of the bed, pulling out the documents one by one, reading through them carefully, not rushing, not allowing myself to feel overwhelmed. If there was one thing I understood clearly now, it was that reacting too quickly would only play into their hands. They believed I was unaware. They believed I was still the same woman who accepted things at face value, who trusted without question. I intended to let them keep believing that. Downstairs, I could hear faint movement, the sound of a door closing, the low murmur of voices. Life continuing as if nothing had changed. And perhaps, on the surface, nothing had. But I knew better now. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the drawer, my movements slow and deliberate. I was not going to confront them. Not yet. There were still too many things I did not know. Too many pieces that had not yet fallen into place. And so, I stood up, smoothed out the fabric of my blouse, and glanced at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared calm, composed, unchanged. That was exactly how I needed to appear. Because whatever they were planning, whatever they believed they could take from me, they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I would never see it coming. Over the next few days, I stopped trying to fill the silence between us, and instead, I listened to it. There is a difference between hearing words and understanding what they mean, and once that difference becomes clear, it is impossible to go back. I noticed how often Emily mentioned timelines now, always framed as casual conversation. "We should really get things settled before the end of the year," she said one afternoon while folding laundry in the living room, her tone soft, almost thoughtful. Daniel nodded from his seat nearby, not even looking up as he added, "It is always better to handle these things early, especially when it comes to property." Property. The word lingered again, heavier each time I heard it. I sat across from them, knitting a scarf I did not need, letting the rhythm of the needles mask the attention I was giving to every detail. "You are probably right," I replied gently, keeping my voice even. "Planning ahead never hurts." Emily smiled at me, satisfied, as if I had just confirmed something important without realizing it. But I was realizing everything now. That evening, after they had gone out for what they described as a quick errand, I walked slowly through the house, not with nostalgia, but with intention. I paused by the small desk in the hallway where Daniel sometimes worked, the surface usually neat, almost too neat. Today, however, there was a folder left slightly askew, as if it had been closed in a hurry. I stood there for a moment, not touching it right away, allowing myself to consider what I was about to do. Then, carefully, I opened it. Inside were printed documents, some of them official, others clearly drafts. My name appeared more than once. So did the word transfer. I did not rush. I read each page slowly, making sure I understood every line. It was not a complete plan, not yet, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that what I had heard was not a misunderstanding. Enough to show that they had already begun putting things into motion. I closed the folder exactly as I had found it, aligning the edges so precisely that no one would suspect it had been touched. Then I returned to my chair and picked up my knitting again, my hands steady, my expression calm. When they came back later that night, laughing softly about something I did not ask about, I greeted them with the same quiet warmth I had always shown. Emily placed her bag on the counter and glanced at me. "You have been quiet today," she said. I smiled faintly. "Just thinking." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to ask more, but then she let it go. That was another thing I had begun to notice. They only asked questions when they felt it was safe to do so. The next morning, I made a small change to my routine. After breakfast, instead of going upstairs, I reached for my coat and my purse. "I have a few errands to run," I said, slipping on my shoes by the door. Emily looked up from the kitchen, surprised. "Do you want me to come with you?" she offered quickly. I shook my head with a gentle smile. "No, it is nothing complicated. I will be back in an hour." Daniel glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, then returned to his phone. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The sky was clear, the kind of bright blue that usually brought a sense of calm. Today, it felt different. Today, it felt like a beginning. I walked down the driveway slowly, not because I needed to, but because I was allowing myself to think clearly, without interruption. They believed I was still inside their version of the story. They believed I would follow the path they had quietly prepared for me. But now, for the first time, I was stepping outside of it. And as I reached the sidewalk and turned toward the street, I made a decision that settled into me with a quiet certainty. I was not going to wait for them to make their move. I was going to understand every part of their plan. And then, when the time was right, I was going to make sure it unraveled in a way they would never see coming. I did not drive far that morning. Only a few miles past the grocery store and the small park where I used to walk on Sundays. But instead of turning toward any familiar place, I continued straight until I reached a quiet office building I had not visited in years. The sign outside had not changed, and neither had the name etched into the glass door. Harrison Legal Services. I paused for a moment before going in, not out of hesitation, but to steady the shift that had already begun inside me. When I stepped through the door, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish, the kind of scent that always reminded me of order and control. A young receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, but it was the voice from down the hallway that truly anchored me. "Margaret." Mr. Harrison stepped into view, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition. "It has been a long time." I returned his smile, though. Mine was quieter, more measured. "Too long," I said. He led me into his office, closing the door behind us with a soft click that seemed to separate this conversation from everything else in my life. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He studied my face, not rudely, but carefully, as if trying to understand why I had come without asking directly. "What can I do for you?" he finally said. I folded my hands in my lap, just as I had the night before, keeping my posture relaxed, my voice calm. "I need to review everything," I said. "My house, my accounts, my will. All of it." He nodded slowly, not questioning the request, only acknowledging its weight. "Of course," he replied. "We can go through everything together." As he began pulling files from his cabinet, I watched the quiet efficiency of his movements, the way each document was handled with care, with precision. It was a different kind of calm than the one I had been living with at home. This was real. This was grounded in facts, not appearances. "Has something changed?" he asked gently after a moment. I considered the question, then gave the simplest answer I could. "I think I have been overlooking things," I said. He did not press further, and I was grateful for that. Instead, he placed the first set of documents in front of me and began explaining them in clear, steady terms. Ownership, beneficiaries, transfer conditions. Each word carried meaning now, not just as legal language, but as pieces of a larger picture I was finally beginning to see. As we reviewed the paperwork, I noticed something that made my hands still for just a second. A recent inquiry had been logged. Not from me, not authorized by me, but connected to my accounts. What is this? I asked, keeping my tone even. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. It appears someone requested preliminary information about asset restructuring, he said. It is not uncommon, but it is usually initiated by the account holder directly. I nodded slowly, letting the information settle without reacting outwardly. And was anything approved? He shook his head. No, it was only an inquiry. Nothing has been changed. That was all I needed to hear. Not panic, not urgency, just confirmation. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands again. As I met his eyes, I would like to make some updates, I said. He did not ask why. He simply nodded and reached for a pen. For the next hour, we worked through each detail carefully. Nothing rushed, nothing overlooked. I asked questions I had never thought to ask before, and he answered each one with quiet clarity. By the time we finished, everything was different, even if it did not appear that way on the surface. When I stood to leave, Mr. Harrison walked me to the door. If there is anything else, he said, you do not have to handle it alone. I gave him a small, sincere nod. I know, I replied. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had earlier, sharper, as if the world itself had shifted slightly. I walked back to my car at the same steady pace, my steps measured, my thoughts clear. They believed they were preparing for the future. They believed they were one step ahead. But as I started the engine and glanced briefly at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I realized something they had not considered. I was no longer reacting to their plan. I was rewriting it. When I returned home, nothing looked different, and that was exactly what I needed. Emily was in the kitchen again, standing by the counter as if she had been there the entire time, her movements calm and unhurried. She glanced up as I walked in, offering that same familiar smile. That did not take long, she said. I set my purse down gently, removing my coat with steady hands. Just a few small errands, I replied. Nothing important. She studied me for a moment, not suspicious, but attentive, as if trying to measure something she could not quite define. Then she nodded and turned back to what she was doing. Daniel was in the living room, scrolling through his phone, the television on but muted. He barely looked up when I entered, offering a brief acknowledgement before returning to his screen. It was all so ordinary, so carefully ordinary. I moved through the house as I always did, placing a glass in the sink, straightening a chair, adjusting a picture frame that did not need adjusting. Small actions, harmless actions, the kind that never draw attention. But now, every movement had purpose. Every moment was part of something larger. That evening, during dinner, Emily brought up the subject again, this time with more direction, though her tone remained gentle. I was thinking, she began, placing a dish on the table. It might be a good idea to sit down together soon and go over everything, just to make sure everything is clear for the future. I looked up at her, meeting her eyes with a soft expression. What do you mean by everything? I asked, my voice calm, almost curious. Daniel set his fork down, glancing between us before speaking. Just the house, your accounts, things like that, he said. It is always better to have a plan in place. I nodded slowly, as if considering the idea for the first time. That makes sense, I said. There are a lot of details to keep track of. Emily smiled, encouraged, her posture relaxing slightly. Exactly, she said. We just want to help. Help. The words settled between us, carrying a meaning that only I seemed to fully understand now. I lowered my gaze briefly, letting a small pause form before I spoke again. Maybe you are right, I said. It might be time to organize things properly. I saw it then, the subtle shift in their expressions. Not excitement, not relief, something quieter, something more controlled. But it was there. They believed I was stepping into the role they had prepared for me. They believed I was agreeing without question, and I let them believe it. Over the next few days, I became exactly what they expected. I asked simple questions. I allowed Emily to explain things to me as if I needed guidance. I listened as Daniel mentioned options, possibilities, small suggestions that seemed reasonable on the surface. There are ways to simplify ownership, he said one afternoon, his tone casual. Make things easier down the line. I nodded, as if the idea was new to me. I would not want things to become complicated, I replied, especially later on. Emily placed her hand lightly on my arm, her touch warm, reassuring. That is why we are here, she said softly. To make sure everything is taken care of. I smiled at her, a quiet, grateful smile that required no effort at all. Because in a way, I was grateful. Not for their intentions, but for their certainty. For the way they had revealed themselves without realizing it. Each conversation gave me more clarity. Each suggestion filled in another piece of the plan they thought I did not see. And all the while, I remained calm. I did not rush. I did not challenge them. I simply followed the path they believed they were leading me down. Because what they did not understand, what they could not see, was that I was no longer walking blindly beside them. I was watching every step, waiting for the exact moment when their confidence would become their greatest mistake. It did not take long for them to bring out the documents. They chose a quiet afternoon, when the light filtered softly through the curtains and everything felt calm, almost intentional. Emily placed the folder on the dining table with careful precision, her fingers smoothing the edges as if presenting something thoughtful rather than strategic. "We thought it might be a good time to go over this together," she said, her voice warm, patient. Daniel pulled out a chair for me, a small gesture that would have once made me feel cared for. Now, I recognized it for what it was. Positioning. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in front of me as I looked at the folder. "Of course," I said. "Let us take a look." Emily opened it, turning the pages toward me one by one, explaining each section in a tone that was almost reassuring. "This is just to simplify things," she said. "It helps avoid complications later." Daniel nodded beside her. "Everything stays within the family. It just makes the process smoother." I listened carefully, my expression calm, my eyes following the lines of text without revealing what I already knew. The language was polished, structured in a way that made everything sound reasonable. Temporary adjustments, shared management, future planning, words designed to comfort, not to alarm. And this would mean what exactly? I asked, my voice soft, almost hesitant, as if I needed their guidance. Emily leaned slightly closer, her tone lowering just enough to feel personal. "It just means we would help oversee things," she said. "Nothing changes for you day to day. Nothing changes." I let the words settle, then nodded slowly. "I see," I replied. "That does sound helpful." Daniel reached for a pen and placed it gently beside the document. "There is no rush," he said. "We can go through everything step by step." I allowed a small smile to form, one that suggested appreciation, even trust. "I would like that," I said. "It is important to understand everything." We spent the next several minutes reviewing the pages, their voices steady, their explanations carefully measured. I asked a few simple questions, the kind they expected. Clarifications about terms. Small concerns about details. Nothing that would raise suspicion. Nothing that would suggest I had already seen something very similar before. At one point, Emily placed her hand lightly over mine, her touch gentle, almost comforting. "We just want to make sure you are taken care of," she said. I met her gaze, holding it for a moment longer than usual. "I know," I replied quietly. And in that moment, I meant it, just not in the way she believed. When the conversation ended, I did not sign anything. Instead, I closed the folder carefully and slid it back toward them. "I would like a little time to think about it," I said. "Just to be sure." There was a brief pause, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But I saw it. The flicker of calculation. The quick adjustment in their expressions. Then Emily smiled again, just as easily as before. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need." Daniel nodded in agreement. "It is a big decision." I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my blouse as I stepped away from the table. "I appreciate you both helping me with this," I said. "It means a lot." And I saw it then. The quiet satisfaction behind their polite expressions. They believed they were close. They believed I was already leaning in the direction they had planned. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, the house quiet around me, I replayed every word, every gesture, every carefully chosen phrase. They had presented their version of the future. They had shown me exactly how they intended to take control. And now, I knew something they did not. I knew the shape of their plan. I knew the timing. I knew the details they thought were hidden beneath polite conversation and gentle smiles. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened street, the stillness of the neighborhood untouched by what was unfolding inside this house. I did not feel anger. I did not feel fear. I felt clarity, because the moment they placed that folder in front of me, they had unknowingly given me everything I needed. And what they would soon learn was this. The person who understands the plan holds the advantage. And I was no longer the one being guided. The following morning, I made a decision that felt simple on the surface, but precise underneath. I would give them what they wanted. Not everything, not truly, but enough to make them believe they were in control. At breakfast, I brought it up myself. I have been thinking about what we discussed, I said, setting my coffee cup down carefully. Emily looked up immediately, her attention sharpening in a way she tried to hide behind a gentle smile. And, she asked softly. I folded my hands, letting a small pause stretch between us. I think it might be time to move forward, I said. Daniel glanced at her, just for a second, but it was enough. That brief exchange carried more meaning than any words they could have spoken. That is a wise decision, he said, his tone measured, but I could hear the satisfaction beneath it. Emily reached across the table, her expression warm, almost relieved. We will make sure everything is handled properly, she said. I nodded, lowering my gaze slightly, as if trusting them completely. I know you will. The rest of the day unfolded exactly as I expected. They moved quickly, but not too quickly, careful not to appear eager. Emily made calls in the afternoon, stepping into another room to keep her voice low, though not low enough. I did not need to hear every word. I only needed to hear enough. Yes, she agreed. She said at one point, her tone controlled but edged with something sharper. We can proceed. I remained in the living room, knitting again, the steady rhythm of the needles matching the calm I maintained on the outside. Inside, I was no longer guessing. I was confirming. That evening, Daniel brought the folder back, this time with additional pages, updated details, small changes that suggested preparation had already been underway long before they ever spoke to me about it. We just refined a few things, he explained, placing the documents in front of me, to make the process smoother. I nodded, my expression thoughtful. I appreciate that, I said. I did not reach for the pen immediately. Instead, I turned each page slowly, reading just enough to maintain the appearance of careful consideration. I asked a question here and there, simple ones, expected ones. And this ensures everything is managed correctly? I asked at one point. Emily leaned closer, her voice reassuring. Exactly. It protects everything. Protects. I almost smiled at the choice of that word, but I kept my expression unchanged. After a few minutes, I placed the papers down and exhaled softly. I trust you, I said, letting the words settle between us. It was the moment they had been waiting for. I could see it in the way Emily's posture shifted, in the way Daniel's hand moved slightly closer to the pen. I picked it up, holding it loosely between my fingers, then paused just long enough to feel the weight of the moment. Not for them. For me. Then, with a calm, steady motion, I signed. The room felt still for a second, as if everything had aligned exactly as they had planned. Emily let out a quiet breath, her smile widening just slightly. Daniel nodded once, a small gesture of satisfaction. We will take care of the rest, he said. I set the pen down gently and looked at them both, my expression soft, almost grateful. I know you will, I repeated. And I meant it, just not in the way they believed. Later that night, after they had gone upstairs, I returned to the dining table and looked at the copy of the documents they had left behind. I did not need to read them again. I already knew what they thought they had secured. What they did not know was this. The papers I had signed were not the ones they believed them to be. Earlier that day, before I ever sat down at that table, I had already finalized everything with Mr. Harrison. Every detail, every condition, every protection. What they held in their hands was only part of the story, and the part they did not see was the one that mattered most. I turned off the light and stood there for a moment in the quiet, letting the darkness settle around me. They believed the plan was complete. They believed they had won. But the truth was much simpler. The moment I signed those papers, the outcome had already been decided, just not in their favor. The next few days were quieter than usual, but not in a way that felt peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something has been set in motion, when people begin to settle into what they believe is already decided. Emily moved through the house with a lighter step, her energy subtly different, as if a weight had been lifted. Daniel spent more time on his phone, occasionally stepping outside to take calls he no longer tried very hard to hide. They spoke more freely now, though still carefully, as if they were standing at the edge of something they did not want to disturb too soon. I watched it all without changing my routine. I made breakfast. I watered the plants. I folded laundry that did not need folding. Small things. Ordinary things. But each moment gave me more clarity. They believed the hard part was over. They believed all that remained was time. One afternoon, Emily suggested we invite a few people over for dinner later that week. Just something simple, she said, her tone casual. It has been a while since we had everyone together. I looked up from my seat, considering her words carefully. That sounds nice, I replied. It would be good to see everyone. She smiled, satisfied, and immediately began listing names. A couple of close family friends. A neighbor or two. People who had known me for years. People who would notice if something felt off. I understood then. This was not just a dinner. This was a stage. That evening, I sat alone in my room again, the soft light from the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. I thought about everything that had led to this point. The quiet conversations. The careful smiles. The documents placed in front of me as if they were an act of kindness. And I thought about what would happen next. Not in anger. Not in fear. Just in certainty. The night of the dinner arrived with a calm that felt almost deliberate. The house was filled with familiar sounds, dishes being set, low music playing in the background, the hum of conversation as guests began to arrive. I greeted each person with the same warmth I always had, my smile steady, my voice calm. Nothing about me suggested that anything had changed. Emily moved gracefully through the room, attentive and composed, while Daniel handled the drinks, his demeanor relaxed, confident. They were comfortable. That was important. As everyone settled around the table, the conversation flowed easily, touching on simple topics, shared memories, light laughter. It was exactly the kind of evening I had once cherished. And in a way, I still did. But now, I saw it differently. I saw the layers beneath it. The timing. The intention. Halfway through the meal, Emily cleared her throat gently, drawing just enough attention without seeming abrupt. We actually have something we wanted to share, she said, her voice warm, inviting. Daniel glanced at her, then reached for a folder placed discreetly on the sideboard. I recognized it immediately. Of course they would choose this moment. Surrounded by witnesses. Framed as something positive. Margaret has made a wonderful decision. Emily continued, looking around the table as if inviting approval. I set my fork down slowly, my movements unhurried, my expression calm. Every eye in the room shifted toward me, waiting, expecting. Daniel opened the folder, preparing to explain, to present, to confirm what they believed had already been secured. And that was when I spoke. Yes, I said softly, my voice steady enough to carry across the table without effort. I did make a decision. The room grew still, not tense, but attentive. I folded my hands neatly in front of me, meeting their eyes one by one before letting my gaze settle on Emily and Daniel. And I think it is only fair that everyone understands exactly what that decision was. For the first time that evening, something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but I saw it. The smallest flicker of uncertainty. The first crack in the certainty they had been holding on to. And I knew, in that moment, that everything they believed was about to change. For a moment, no one spoke. The soft clinking of silverware had stopped, and even the quiet music in the background seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. I let the silence settle, not rushing to fill it, not forcing the moment forward. Then I reached calmly to my right and picked up a second folder, one that had not been there when the evening began. I placed it gently on the table in front of me, aligning it with quiet precision before opening it. Before anything else is said, I continued, my voice even and composed. I would like to clarify something. Emily's smile held, but it had changed. It was tighter now, more controlled. Daniel's hand remained on the edge of his folder, though he no longer moved to open it further. I could see it in their eyes. They were listening differently now. Carefully, I turned the first page toward the center of the table, not dramatically, not as a reveal, but simply as a fact. Earlier this week, I met with my attorney, I said. We reviewed all of my accounts, my property, and every legal document connected to my name. A few of the guests exchanged glances, sensing the shift even if they did not yet understand it. I continued without raising my voice. During that review, I discovered that someone had already made inquiries about transferring control of my assets. I did not look at Emily or Daniel when I said it. I did not need to. The silence answered for them. No changes were approved, I added calmly. But it raised a question I could not ignore. I paused briefly, letting the words settle into the room before moving forward. So I made a decision. I lifted the document slightly, just enough for those closest to see the official seal at the bottom of the page. Everything has now been placed under a protected trust, managed independently, with clear conditions that cannot be altered without my direct and verified consent. Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his confidence adjusting into something more cautious. Emily's hand moved from the table to her lap, her fingers folding together tightly. I met their eyes then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. No one can access, transfer, or manage anything without oversight, I said. Not now, not later. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet. It was sharper, more aware. One of the guests cleared their throats softly, as if unsure whether to speak. I closed the folder in front of me, my movements slow and deliberate, then placed my hands neatly on top of it. As for the documents that were presented to me, I continued, glancing briefly at the folder Daniel still held. I did sign what was placed in front of me. That was the moment they had been holding on to. I could see it return, just for a second. That small flicker of certainty. And then I let it disappear. But what you did not realize, I said gently, is that those documents were already legally overridden before I ever sat down at that table. Emily's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough. The warmth was gone. In its place was something uncertain, something searching for footing that was no longer there. Daniel's grip on the folder tightened slightly, though he said nothing. I did not need him to. Everything you thought was being transferred, I said, my voice steady, remains exactly where it has always been. Under my control. I let the words rest there, not pushing them further, not turning them into something louder than they needed to be. The truth did not require emphasis. It simply required space. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. I believe in planning for the future, I added quietly. But I also believe in understanding who is part of that future. No one interrupted. No one rushed to respond. The room held its breath, not out of tension, but out of realization. I glanced once more at Emily and Daniel, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with something far simpler. Finality. Then I reached for my glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down with the same quiet care I had shown all evening. Dinner is getting cold, I said softly. We should not let it go to waste. And just like that, I returned to my seat, my hands steady, my mind clear, leaving them to sit with the one thing they had never expected. Not resistance, not confrontation, but the quiet certainty that they had been seen all along.